Hello, everybody, and welcome. You've found your way again to a Hero Wednesday webinar. It's April 27th, and I have such a privilege today to be able to welcome Derek Yach, who is the Senior Vitality Consultant with the Vitality Group. And as you can see on your screen, we're going to be talking about some pretty big ideas today, the integration of health and sustainability development into our reporting platforms. I've often reflected that we have growing ambitions in our field and that we have added many aspects of well-being and culture and engagement to our portfolio in addition to health, or because of our interest in advancing health. And Dr. Yach, as you're going to see today, is going to talk us through even more ambitious thinking about how we can better integrate our work with those 3 Ps that many corporations care about, not just the profits that their shareholders expect from them, but their contribution to their people and their communities' people and to the planet at writ large. And you'll hear Derek reflecting today about how we can be better and integrated about that. He is so well qualified. I often find myself when I have occasion to talk to our relatively newcomers to this field to really try to test their health promotion work in the public sector and in the private sector, and if they can, even in the nonprofit or governmental sectors. If you look at Dr. Yach's background, he's exactly who's had the kind of interesting life that I hope for all of our folks working in this line of work. In addition to his Chief Health Officer role at Vitality, he was previously Senior Vice President of Global Health and Agriculture Policy at PepsiCo. He headed up Global Health at the Rockefeller Foundation. He was Professor of Global Health at Yale University, former Executive Director for Non-Communicable Diseases and Mental Health at the WHO, and his credentials go on and on. I would commend for those of you, as always, to look at some of his footprint online. As I'm trying to get to know scholars and leaders in our field, I find myself getting to know them on PubMed, and you won't be disappointed with the 70-plus articles. Dr. Yach, you are published everywhere and in some of the best journals in the planet. Did a piece not that long ago on the World Health Organization's reform, a normative or operational organization, you asked, and that was published in the American Journal of Health Promotion. The one that got my attention was this one that you did with many colleagues that was reported in the Lancet. You asked about the interaction, essentially, between human health and planetary health, things that you're going to be reflecting on today with us. You write about a tobacco-free world, a call to action by phasing out sale of tobacco products by 2040 rather. So we have on hand a great thinker and a great scholarly writer, but I'd also commend our listeners to go visit Dr. Yach's LinkedIn page. You'll get to know him a bit there, but he's also, in addition to scientific peer-reviewed articles, been very generous, I think, Derek, in the number of times you'll write more popular reflections, blog-like posts that you offer on LinkedIn. And you've talked about your TEDx talk that you just did in Monte Carlo and making prevention and disease prevention a priority. You talked about some of your experience at the Clinton Global Initiative, how Bill and you all are trying to change the world, and on these goes. I did read this morning your workplace health begins at home piece, where you reflect on healthy buildings. You can also find some of the reports that Dr. Yach and his group do on the Vitality website. They have a great way of organizing by projects, by evidence, by articles. If time allows, we will pull up some of the Vitality Group's work that was featured in the World Economic Forum. It's a paper that got my attention when it came out, and if we have time, Derek, we might come back to that one. I think I first invited you to join us when I saw an article that you had done together with Nico Pronk that was published in the American College of Sports Medicine's journal, where you talked about reporting in health and well-being, aligning human capital with business resources was something that I know you've been advocating for some time, and you were all generous enough to share specifically some of these core questions by category, so we might get back to that as well, Derek, today. But welcome, so glad to have you here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Paul, and really a fantastic outline you gave, and I can only now underperform relative to what people are expecting. So very high standard set. And I think many of the colleagues I've had a privilege to work with are so well known to Hero, Nico being an extraordinary person, Ron Getzel, and many others. So what I hope to do is really outline what sounds a bit of an esoteric discussion around integrating health and sustainable development into reporting platforms, and really try and highlight both why this could be really significant to ensure that health in the workplace gets the priority that it deserves, and secondly, give a sense of how we're getting a lot of traction from around the world in making this a reality. Next slide. We need to go back a little bit and think about how well is health represented in other major indices. And one of the ones I always like to start with is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. There's a wonderful new book out by Isan Masood called The Great Invention, which is the whole story of the creation of GDP, and that it was actually created as a means of verifying whether the US investments in the Marshall Plan in the post-war reconstruction in Europe were actually having the desired impact on the economy. So that was an era of great transparency when government was putting a lot of money into reconstruction, and they decided that the main way of measuring outcome, the success, was going to be through gross domestic product. And I won't go through its construction, and I think you understand GDP probably fairly well, but it hides a lot of things that communities feel has a high degree of value. It doesn't, for example, measure quality of the environment. It doesn't highlight unpaid work or informal work. It doesn't address many issues of inequalities by race, by class, by gender. And so it's a very crude measure where you can have real distortions. Over the years, there have been a lot of efforts to try and include health into it. And when GDP was enhanced by the UN Development Program in their indices, health at least came up in terms of including a life expectancy measure. But by and large, GDP still remains the yardstick by which development progress is assessed. Next slide. In contrast to where the metrics lie, has been the evolution of thinking about the importance of health. And I go back to Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was both my boss at WHO, and well before them, many consider her the mother of sustainable development in her work as Prime Minister of Norway, Environment Minister of Norway, and never forget she was Health Minister with her MPH from Harvard. And she coined this simple line that health is at the center of sustainable development. It is a major input into its attainment and a measure of its success. And I just dwell on that for a second, because when we get to the workplace, we understand how important it is to see that health is an input into the productivity, the morale, the retention, and in fact, the ability of a company to perform. But it's also a measure of its impact in terms of its products and services in the outside world. Both aspects need to be addressed. We've seen over the last few years that health is linked to the quality of the environment, and in this commission, the commission led by Rockefeller and Lancet, the whole notion of placing health more firmly within the broader debate around the health of the planet, I think was achieved to some extent, and those interested might want to go online and look at the Wellcome Trust's investment in Our Planet, Our Health, the Rockefeller investment since this report at Harvard in building a whole discipline and focus around it, all to suggest that this will become a big driving force in the future. Next slide. Now, it's not true to say that there aren't more complex reporting platforms out there in the world that address, but increasingly, environmental, social, and good governance issues. And I think part of the reason this is happening is because the investor community, shareholders, and consumers alike all demand greater transparency in the work of particularly corporations. And they've gone beyond looking purely at the financial accounts of a company to assess its long-term performance. So we have the UN Global Compact, which leads the UN in defining how and what companies should be reporting. The Global Reporting Initiative sets out the reporting standards around the world for companies, and its advice is now followed by 40 stock exchanges around the world and many thousands of corporations. And here in the US, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, or in the UK, FTSE for Good, or in South Africa, King 4, all have varying types of reporting structures that address environment, sustainability, diversity, good governance. Next slide. Before jumping onto health, one of the reflections that I've always been interested in is that there's been a concern that the reason that many companies have historically only focused on their financial bottom line was really driven by Milton Friedman and a philosophy from the Chicago School many years ago, that the sole purpose of a company was to maximize shareholder return. And that spooked many companies into addressing the long-term impact and benefit on the environment and on their health. There have been recent court challenges to ask whether if a company takes its money that could potentially go to shareholders and puts it into improvements in health or the quality of life or the quality of the environment, they could be open to being sued. And I put up here a fantastic book called The Shareholder Myth, which Lynn Stout at Cornell Law School wrote, which dispels this notion and reminds us that over the decades there have been challenges to this. The very first one was when Henry Ford wanted to raise the wages of his employees. And at the time, he was challenged by the Dodge brothers, who were shareholders, and they demanded that the money rather go to them than to be invested in the company for its employees. Well, it went all the way through the court system, who ruled in the end that because companies are licensed to operate in perpetuity, they need to act accordingly. And that is interpreted as saying, invest in the long term, invest in the health of the employees, invest in the health of consumers, invest in the environment. And the challenges continue today. I put up one of the more interesting one was the Doors, the music group, the pop group of the time. Jim Morrison led it. And for years there was a written agreement that they would not take their music and allow it to be used for little jingles and adverts, because it would debase the value of their long-term proposition. Well, after he died, 2 members of the band did actually want to do it, and the third member, Dennison, who survived, refused to allow them to do it on the grounds that this was going to undermine the long-term value of the company, and went all the way through the court system and won. So let's turn to the next slide. We ask, well, where is health in these reporting indices? And why should it be there? The first answer is that with the exception of very limited aspects of occupational health and safety, health per se, the broad aspects of health, including cardiovascular, mental health, a wide range of other conditions, is not considered at this stage in any of the major indices in the world. Should it be, and what are the logic? Well, we believe that health should be there because it's a critical input into workplace health. It's a measure of the impact of a company's impact on the core products and services it produces, and I'll explain this. And also health, the investment in private-public investments doesn't just enhance the health of the public, but it comes back to materially benefit the health of a company. Next slide. I think that on this call, I'm sure there are many of you who are in touch with or doing the research that makes the case for why effective workplace health programs show solid financial returns to investors and many other positive benefits. I just put up on this slide, on the left-hand side, data by Ray Fabius and his colleagues, and on the right-hand side, work by Daniel Milan and Conradi and his colleagues, the one giving a US perspective, the other South African perspective on the same question. If we invest in the stock of companies who have received major awards for workplace health programs over the years, and look at their stock performance over the long run, many, many years, and compare it to those who have not received such awards, what happens to stock performance? And this is one snapshot of a huge amount of literature that shows that generally the companies who have got the better health programs as defined by independent assessments outperform their colleagues in many ways, in terms of stock performance, in terms of productivity, morale, retention, and certainly in terms of long-term healthcare costs. And for each of those, there's a large body of literature that HERO has actually played a central role in both stimulating its development of and enhancing it and getting it out. So increasingly, that empirical case is there. And many people would argue, as I would, that the quality of the plant and machinery of a company may in fact be less important, the investment in one of the most important sources of capital, human capital, and within that, human health, yet we don't report it. Next slide. The second aspect relates to the impact of companies through their products and services. Now, if you think of the environment, over the last decade or two, it's become extremely common for companies to have to report on the environmental footprint, whether it's the impact on carbon use, water pollution, water impact, other forms of contamination or improvement in the quality of the environment. Similarly, they're increasingly reporting on diversity at work, not because these are very nice things to do, but because they actually materially benefit the bottom line of a company. A company which focuses more on addressing water recycling, water quality, will have a better ability to actually run a good beverage business, as Coke and Pepsi and Nestle now understand. A company that has a greater proportion of diversity at work tends to outperform in terms of innovation and R&D compared to other companies. So let's just remind ourselves about many of the key products and services that are directly and indirectly impacted by companies. Certainly food, tobacco products, sodas. Motor vehicle injury rates are affected, of course, by quality of cars. Alcohol, I don't have to tell you about. The entire sports sector, you could say, is a major positive source of benefit. The pharmaceutical industry has generally a positive footprint, but there are many negative aspects of it. And of course, the insurance sector I come from has till now been pretty static in terms of being an active supporter of prevention and health promotion. Next slide. Next one. The third area is we know that from our own empirical research in the US, we know that there are certain sectors, business sectors, where the health risks of the employee are likely to be very difficult to overcome through workplace programs alone. One obvious example is the transport and warehousing sector, where you have among the highest levels of risk and you have among the highest levels of preventable disease, often in the face of a transport company wanting to do the right thing, but the nature of the work makes it very difficult. Similarly, we know that the nature of manufacturing and retail, often with low-paid employees on a large scale, working in communities with high levels of community levels of risk, whether it's tobacco, poor access to unhealthy food, the inability to actually manage time for sports and activity, all of that contributing to it being much tougher for even the most effective workplace program to have the desired effect that it would, say, in a white-collar sector. And that makes the argument for why we need to have closer synergy between the employer and the local community to understand how you can have an impact on ensuring that the people who are your employees are most likely to benefit improves of health, leading back to productivity gains for the company. But the consumers also, their health matters, and we know that healthier consumers are more likely to also be greater purchasers within the retail environment. Next slide. So if we were to have metrics to focus on progress, what could some of them look like? Well, we're in an interesting time when the biggest risk of all, tobacco, still kills 480,000 people in the US. There are just under 40 million smokers. There's a huge debate around smoking cessation, but there's also a debate around reduced risk products, whether they are e-cigarettes or some of the other products. Well, presumably one would want to give a different judgment to a tobacco company that may be actively trying to lower risk as to one which is just continuing with business as usual. Similarly, in the food space, we're seeing a huge amount of reformulation going on, focused on reducing salt, sugar, trans fats, expanding fruits and vegetables. Well, if you're an investor, you would actually want to make sure that you understood what is the impact on health of these benefits, knowing that the higher degree of profitability is increasingly coming from the companies who are starting to spend more on the healthier part of a portfolio. Next one. I use this example from the UK of how we've seen Tesco, the second largest retailer in the world, remove sweets and candies from the checkout counters of all stores and then offer free fruit to kids. Not because it's a very nice moral thing to do, which it is, but because it's having a material benefit on their bottom line, attracting younger consumers, families with kids, who are more likely to go there and more likely now to buy healthier products, showing that a healthy business case actually can benefit the bottom line of a retailer. And those who missed it, CVS in the last couple of weeks has announced that based on their success of their turning their stores into tobacco-free stores, they are making a complete makeover which will actually take them along the lines of Tesco and even further, to actually stress that they will remove certain lines and products from their store and put in place a vaster, larger array of health-related products. I have no doubt that they're doing it because they know it's going to benefit their bottom line, but simultaneously, it's going to also benefit the health of consumers. Now, we need metrics to show how that they're not only just addressing the sustainability of their supply, but the overall healthfulness. And for a retailer, that should suggest to an investor, that's where we want to go, or to a consumer, that's where we want to purchase. Next one. Here are some examples of some companies which are now going to the level of recognizing they need to address the community constraints. So Novo Nordisk, you could say, well, why would they want to invest in cities when their main focus is simply getting insulin out of the door? They're the largest producer of insulin worldwide. Well, they recognize that there's enormous potential synergy between the messages of addressing diabetes from the prevention and the management side and doing it in defined cities than simply being lumped as another pharmaceutical manufacturer. And having seen the way they're working, they are now expanding across cities in Malaysia, South Africa, Europe, and the US. And as they're expanding, it's both having a positive impact on the community, but also the community's response long-term to the company. The same, I think, is true in some very interesting ways in which PepsiCo has been working with the Tuberculosis Alliance to take one of their core capabilities, which is around taste, to improve the flavor of tuberculosis therapy. Now, that may sound pretty obscure to people on this call, but one of the biggest constraints on improving adherence to TB, which is still a global scourge in most of the developing world, is the taste of these products, which are terrible. Now, I'm not sure that these are going to be Pepsi or Frito-Lay flavored products, one hopes not, but they will certainly use their science and their technology to ensure that you have a higher uptake and continual use, which in the end will actually have a big impact on tuberculosis, on community health, and again, the reflection comes back to them. Next slide. I found it very interesting that a colleague, Jason Saul, who I've been working with, is partnering here with Marjorie Paloma from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where what Jason has been doing is he's been asking the question, how are consumers responding in terms of the overall healthfulness and the health image and products and services of companies? Does it really affect their decisions on where they go to purchase? One of the examples they found was that historically, if people decided to go to a food service company, McDonald's, Burger King, whatever it was, the only things that determine whether they go tend to be related to price, taste, and convenience. Well, that was historically true. It's no longer true today, when they're finding that particularly millennials have added in two other factors that often exceed taste and even price. And they are the sustainability of the food supply and the healthfulness of the food in terms of basic ingredients. That explains the dramatic shift that we're seeing in terms of young people initially starting to go to certain fast food companies over others. And I think the explosion of companies like Chipotle, Local, a range of healthier companies, fruit and vegetable-based companies. This is a deep shift happening in society, and it's not just happening with regard to food service. It's probably happening on food products, on anything connected to health. Health and the environment are becoming major drivers of consumer behavior, and the companies who get it early are the ones who will win long term. Next slide. So where are we to date, and what can we expect over the next while? We try to synthesize the material, and this everything here is available for you, particularly the report on health, which is a report we did with people like Nico, like investors, a wide range of people advising us, and released it in Davos at the World Economic Forum just over a year ago. I'd say the response initially was huge interest, but not really a sudden jump to action. Well, I think that's changed now. And I mentioned earlier that the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the major body advising both the UN, companies, stock exchanges on reporting standards, and the group who really brought us many of the environmental standards that are now part of accounting and reporting, have agreed to upgrade their current standards on occupational health and safety, and formed a work group to do that, with the goal of actually having on the table by March 2018 a final report on how we can take a broader aspect of health into the reporting standards, and not in general terms, but very specific terms. Which standards need to change? How do we move beyond the injury focus to include issues related to the heart, the mind? How do we address the fact that we've got an older demographic now at work? What are the specifics that we're going to be recommending to stock exchanges and to thousands of companies worldwide? And I say we because I was very pleased and lucky to be invited to be part of the working group that's doing this. And the process, I think, should involve all of you. The first draft will probably be ready by September or so, and then it'll be placed on a public website for 90 days of public input, ideally, hopefully informed input, particularly from the worlds of health, occupational health and safety, the traditional worlds, but also people who are in their own companies trying to push the boundaries. Because once we get the standards accepted, they're likely to be adopted quite quickly by a number of the stock exchanges around the world as the way to move ahead. The underlying philosophy of remind ourselves of why we're doing it is that the belief is that what gets measured in a report and is required to get report gets the attention of the C-suite, gets the investment of the C-suite. And one of the fundamental shifts we're trying to do in the reporting is to get companies at the highest level of governance to take the approach they have on the environment, to understand they're doing this not because it's a nice thing to do or an ethical or a moral thing to do, but because it's going to be the right thing for the long-term financial sustainability and profitability of companies. When it gets embedded into the business argument for a company, we're likely, and I really believe that this will happen, to see a greater focus both on prevention and health promotion at workplace, instead of seeing it as a cost, seeing it as an investment, and secondly, seeing the opportunity opening to rethink the entire product portfolio to ensure that it has the maximum impact on public health. And the last slide. If we succeed, I think that in the end, the United Nations Global Compact, which is the highest level of the UN formally designated to work with the private sector, will be able to ensure that at least Sustainable Development Goal number 3, as well as number 8, 3 being good health and well-being, 8 being decent work and economic growth, would be seen as drivers of change, and that the private sector, through their work, can play a material and really beneficial effect to the attainment of these SDGs. Thanks, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Yach. And this is an invitation for questions from our audience. Just go ahead and type those in as you always do, and I'll try to consolidate. We've scheduled this just for the half hour, but I'm going to take executive privilege given we have a high volume of people paying attention and according to the system. So I'm going to let us keep running, Derek, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Let me observe for you that just as I reflected on your career being that interesting blend of public and private sector and nonprofit kinds of work that you've done, I just listened to your presentation and kept observing that you seamlessly move between private sector initiatives, public sector initiatives, community-based initiatives. If I were to ask you to reflect for an audience here that really is a lot of worksite health promotion folks, I noticed Dr. Wayne Burton is on the line, so as a CMO for American Express, I think he can resonate fairly quickly to the idea of getting in front of the C-suite. But so many of our colleagues here are pretty ensconced in the private sector and don't have as easy access to the C-suite. Your report says, you know, you ought to get once a year in front of your C-suite with some of these health and well-being issues. Any advice in terms of this sphere of influence from the folks who are mostly in the private sector in terms of how that would happen, how they can help make that happen?
It's a great question, and I think there are many routes in. I must say I was privileged in two major areas I've been employed. One was with PepsiCo and with Discovery Vitality, where I didn't have a choice. In both cases, the CEO, Indra Nooyi and Adrian Gore, believe that health is central to their own development and the future of companies. So that's the first recommendation. If you want to have an easy life, choose a company where the passion is already there. And I know Wayne's in one. I have colleagues in J&J and Novo Nordisk and many of the obvious companies, CVS. The tougher issue is particularly in the smaller and medium enterprise companies, where one has to repeat the evidence over and over to find where the champion is, to find the opportunity. And often the opportunity is a senior person either having somebody in their family who's gets sick, or a leading person in the company gets sick. That represents one of the great opportunities to talk about how we could be doing better for all of us, how it affects the productivity and morale. There's nothing like, I say, when somebody particularly gets laid off for a while with a mental health condition, suddenly a topic that is virtually impossible to talk about at work gets attention high up in the company. So I would say, you know, number one, just keep on going, make sure the data is as good and succinct as possible. And increasingly, one has to contrast the cost of healthcare against the value of health promotion and keep plugging away at that point, because eventually they will get it, that the costs are not immutable. They can be changed, but they'll only be changed if you have the ability to invest in a effective, well thought out, comprehensive program along the lines that Hero advocates for.
I noticed the footer of some of your PowerPoint slides were at Swim Daily. I assumed as much. I hadn't looked into it before your presentation, but here you are swimming daily. Do you care to share what part of the planet you seem to be crossing an ocean here on this particular swim? This actually was between the Statue of Liberty and the Freedom Tower. Actually, we had a race a couple of years ago, last year actually, just after 9/11. It's held every year. But yeah, if I can find any decent pond, river, lake, pool, fun, I'll go and swim in it. Yeah. Hey, just a couple more questions. Again, I observed your interesting and seamless back and forth you went between your public examples and your private examples. You brought up Discovery towards the end there, and when I think about the regulatory environment between South Africa, for example, and some of the innovation you all did in use of incentives and insurance there that with your help found its way into the States, and think about the current Preserving Workplace Wellness Programs Act that's getting a lot of attention for the privacy issues that we're going to struggle with from a regulatory standpoint, to the replacement of the Affordable Care Act. When you think about your energy, the energy for our field, how much, when you think about this idea that these metrics need to get to the shareholder level. How much of the action do you think is in the public and regulatory and political sphere as it relates to making these more likely to find their way into corporate America compared to advocacy within the private sector itself? Where would you be advising our audience put their energy?
Well, I think we have a huge opportunity in the US that still hasn't been fully tapped, and that is to keep stressing the fact that while we know that within a workplace, healthcare costs for the employer can be lowered by prevention, the same, of course, is true at the national level with regard to the big debates on the cost of healthcare. And I would say a greater understanding of the role of the Congressional Budget Office, of the underlying assumptions of the actuaries who are looking at some of the costing and the future of Medicare and the entitlement programs, really opens the door to us saying, well, how is it possible that we know that through a range of incentives and health promotion programs, we're able to lower healthcare costs, which usually mean below the age of 65, and then people go into the Medicare pool, and we don't have an equivalent government approach using the same levels of innovation to keep maintaining the levels low. So I think that taking the best of the private sector and framing it in a way in how it would benefit the Medicare program, I think ultimately remains one of the biggest opportunities that we're not tackling. And it may be that when there's such a big transition in government as we now have, this may be something where people will listen to this idea with new ideas. And the basic concept we've been stressing, and we talk to governments around the world, is that surely Medicare should have greater leverage over the quality of health of people who get delivered into the Medicare program, and surely they should be putting in place even more rigorous incentives or disincentives if employers are not doing what is at least a reasonable minimal, as opposed to leaving it entirely voluntary to the workplace. I think we know that we could lower the long-term cost structure by between 15%, maybe a little bit higher, simply by putting in some of the best programs that we have in employer-based programs already.
Yep. Last question, and I'll let you go, and really thank you for your time and expertise today. I alluded earlier to this report that you and Nico put together that is available for our listeners to just Google the title of this report with Dr. Pronk and Dr. Yach, and you'll find this pops and is available as a PDF. Selfishly, I want to connect, again, the Vitality core question by category and the scorecard you advocate for. We already talked about number 2, what would it be like to get on an annual basis in front of the board of directors. I wanted to get your reflections on number 5, just because selfishly on June 6th, HERO will be hosting one of our members' think tanks, and our topic this year is called Systemic Approaches to Improving Mental and Emotional Well-Being, and we're going to tackle things like resiliency and these individually focused kinds of initiatives that so many places are doing, but we're really going to try to focus on what's upstream of mental health problems before they hit their employee assistance programs. One of the articles that you've written and shared on your own LinkedIn page relates to this need, not just for integrating these data as you've described today, but also for better integration of some of the EAP, mental well-being, mental health issues with some of the overall health and well-being strategy. Do you feel like, for sure we've experienced the stigma downstream with issues of depression. Do you feel like the stigma is also going to be a barrier for us if we try to get upstream of some of these mental health issues for organizations? And then the references you want to point us to in terms of good examples of people who are systemically trying to get after some of these mental emotional well-being issues?
Yeah, and I think this is a critical issue. I think one starting point for people online, and you may want to dig up the references, was last year the World Bank, during their spring meeting of finance ministers, not health ministers, finance ministers, focused for 2 days on the importance of addressing mental health from an economic and productivity point of view. The Minister of Finance of Canada opened the meeting, and then the President of the World Bank, of course himself a physician, led off. And from then on you had CEOs talking about the way they're addressing stigma at work. You had leading people from the finance community addressing it. And I keep stressing that because I think that there was a fantastic set of ideas and reports produced about enhancing workplace health. I think recognizing the role of the finance minister or the chief financial officer of a company in starting to understand this is the best way of addressing both stigma and eventually the need for funding. It's a long road, but it always amazes me once somebody senior in the company starts speaking out, it suddenly becomes a legitimate discussion to have equivalent eventually to how we talk about how we become more active in the workplace. And pretty soon, the stigma issue disappears.
Well, we have treaded all the way from Jim Morrison to the Chief of Economics for the World Bank, so I don't think we could have covered more broad and important territory together, but I know we could carry on for quite some time, but I want to be respectful of your time and our participants' time, and thank you again, Dr. Yach, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for listening.
All right. We are all adjourned. Thanks again. Bye-bye.